Well, Merry Christmas, everybody. I hope you are having a beautiful time celebrating Jesus with your family. And I am so thankful that you are taking time on Christmas Day to be with Jesus and be part of this devotion so you can worship Him. That's what we should do on His birthday, don't you think? So thank you so much for that. We are in a very important passage today, Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. And I want to ask the question, excuse me, what happened at Bethlehem? Now think about that for a moment. What happened at Bethlehem on that first Christmas, so to speak? Paul tells us in this passage that it was so much more than simply a baby being born in a manger. The Philippians are, they're facing some opposition from the world against them as believers. And Paul in this book is encouraging them to stick together, to not be selfish, to support and love one another and to serve one another. And in chapter 2, he uses Jesus' story, Jesus' experience, as his example, if you will, to inspire them to sacrifice for one another, to love one another. And so let's read together starting at verse 5, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, he says, "Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Now, he's saying in verse 5, Philippians, you believers there in the city of Philippi, have the attitude, the mindset, the kind of thinking Jesus had. When it comes to your relationships with each other, have the mindset that Jesus had toward us. In verse 6, that even though he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God as a thing to be grasped. Now, my Bible says, and this is the New American Standard, he existed in the form of God. The NIV translates it being in very nature God. The King James Version translates it being in the form of God. So what's going on here? Well, the word that is translated existed, being, is the Greek word that speaks of a person's essential being, who he or she is. So what it's saying is that Jesus, whose example they are to follow, his essential being, his essential personhood, he existed as God, okay? And when it says the form of God, or the NIV, the very nature of God, it's the idea of the outward appearance, the outward shape. So what's he saying? He's saying that Jesus, his essential being, his existence was God. And when the form, the appearance was God. In other words, he's saying Jesus is God. Jesus is divine. Jesus is deity. It's who he was, who he is. It's how he existed. Then he goes on to say that he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. The word did not regard is the idea to consider, to think about, if you will. And he did not consider equality is his existence in his essence as divine, as a thing to be grasped, or the King James says robbery to be equal with God. The NIV is a bad translation of that phrase. And so let's look at it again. So his essential being, the way he existed, was as God. That was his form. Why? Because that's who he is. But he had the mindset. He had the mindset that this deity was not something to be grasped, or the King James robbery. There's two ways to interpret that phrase. One is the idea that that it's not robbery for Jesus to say he is God. Why? Because he's not stealing anything. It's who he is. He is God. So it's not robbery for Jesus to hold on to and make the claim that he's God. The second interpretation, and the way the NASB translates it, is that Jesus did not grasp or cling to or hold on to his deity in such a way that it prevented him from stepping into this world and as our sacrifice and taking upon himself humanity with all of its weaknesses. And I think Paul probably had both those ideas in mind when he chose this particular Greek word. So let's get the picture. We're walking through this, and I'm teaching a little bit longer because it's important we understand who we are celebrating on Christmas. So look at this again. So Jesus exists in his essential person or being in the form of God, because that's who he is. But he had the attitude, the mindset, the kind of thinking that holding on to and clinging to his deity, to his existence in heaven, so to speak, was his mindset was not that would prevent him from adding to himself a human body with all of the challenges that brought, and that it wasn't robbery for him to say, I'm deity. That's what's being said so far, okay? Now, in verse 7, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Now, some people over the centuries have erroneously misunderstood Jesus emptying himself as to say Jesus gave up his deity. He gave up his divinity. He stopped being divine or God, and when he came to the earth, and he simply became human. And that is not what he's saying here. The NIV says he made himself nothing. The King James made himself of no reputation. The New Living Translation gave up his divine privileges. And that gets at the idea. The idea is that he emptied himself. He emptied himself not of his deity, of his essential nature, because you can't change your nature. Think about this for a moment. If a king, someone who's really a king, dresses up incognito, okay, puts on a disguise and goes out among the people to just observe or be with them, but he's disguised himself. Let me ask you, did he stop being king? No, he's still king. He's just dressed up differently. Okay, so when Jesus empties himself to come to this earth, he doesn't give up his deity. You can't change who you are, your essential essence of being and nature. That's think about the debate going on in our culture today about a man becoming a woman or a woman becoming man. No, what you are born is what you are. Jesus is divine. When he emptied himself by coming to the earth, it wasn't that he gave up his deity, but he did empty himself of some of the privileges, you might say, when he came to this earth. By taking on a body like ours, it says in verse 7, the form or made like a man, he took on a human body, meaning that the divine, eternal, creating God, Jesus, the Word that we saw yesterday, who was in the beginning with God and created all that is, by taking upon himself a human body, was able to suffer. Able to suffer in a way that without that human flesh, he could not. He gave up the privilege of not suffering the pains of death. And so he says in verse 7, he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness. Okay, so what did he do? He added to himself a human body. The divine one who had one nature now has two natures. He didn't give up one and replace it with the other. He had added to him, he took to himself the other nature. Now, back to the Philippians, Paul is encouraging them to be humble and sacrificial like Jesus. And we see the humility of Jesus in his willingness to leave heaven and come to earth, his willingness as the divine one to add to his own essential essence and being a body, a human nature, if you will. That's not selfish. That's sacrificial. That's love. And this example of Jesus is one that at Christmas, we who are members of families need to hear. We who, as individuals, need to hear it. We as members of a church or a life group, we need to hear it. Because what he's saying here is Jesus was willing to sacrifice and not cling to his privilege for the sake of others. And isn't that what makes family work, what makes a church work, what makes a community work? Because when everybody is selfish, nothing works. And I understand why Paul chose to use the example of Jesus to encourage the Philippians. But I want to wrap this up real quickly by pointing out something I alluded to a moment ago that is a doctrinal truth, a theological truth about Jesus' two natures. Jesus is divine. Not that he was, but he is. He was, he is, he always will be. Yesterday, John 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and God was the Word. Everything that was made was through the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's Jesus, eternal, divine, God. Here, in this passage, existed essential being, essential essence, God in the form of God. Why? Because he is God. So Jesus has always eternally been God. That's one nature. But the second nature is his humanity. See, he existed, he has the essence, he's eternal as God, but his humanity had a beginning. That's why in verse 8, being found he was found in appearance as a man. Back up in verse 7, he took on the form of a bondservant. He was made in the likeness of men. So there was a beginning to the humanity, the human nature of Jesus. That's what happened at Bethlehem. That's what we call the incarnation of Jesus. So here's the two natures of Jesus. Eternally has been, is, and will be God. Starting at Bethlehem, he also added to his nature, human nature, a body. And that continues. So what about today? Did Jesus give up his human nature when he died? No. When he was raised from the dead, he still had a body. It was a spiritual body. It's the kind of body you and I will have when we're raised from the dead and we're in heaven. So Jesus, who was eternally God, today forward still has the human nature. The glorified, resurrected one that we will have. But he exists today, we say in theology, as fully God and fully man. And so Christmas celebrates the fact that Jesus loved you enough, and he loved everybody else so much, that he was willing to say, I'm not going to stay up here and just be God. I'm going to go through the trauma, if you will, of adding a body, human nature, to me, he says to himself, so he could save us. What you're celebrating at Christmas is a love that was not selfish, a love that was sacrificial. Honor Jesus today by loving others the same way and by sacrificing for him and not just making life about you or what you want or what you like. Hey, Merry Christmas. Tomorrow, we're going to start looking at Jesus when he comes back, Revelation 12 and Revelation 1. God bless you. Merry Christmas. See you Sunday morning, one service, 10 a.m.